the way I want to approach this conversation, having covered broadly what a feminist foreign policy in the abstract looks like, we want to examine in India specifically how a feminist foreign policy interacts and intersects with national interests and the degree to which there may or may not be trade-offs. We also, secondly, want to discuss this issue of intersectionality, right? When we talk about a more inclusive foreign policy, it's not just feminism per se, but also other, bringing in other voices other than just non-patriarchal voices. And the third issue that we want to discuss is the domestic foundations of a feminist foreign policy and whether India has the institutional apparatus and the political base to support this.
How do we change the nature of what national interest could be? I think is where a feminist foreign policy then offers us a different perspective. Now, whether that national interest means something for India is different from what it means for Australia, what it means for Sweden. Absolutely, it's always going to be different. But at the end of the day, when we talk about a policy, whether it is for our neighborhood, whether it is for with a bilateral partner, do we bring in that value system? Do we bring in that lens in that conversation, in that policy decision-making process? And then in that implementation process, I think is where that is where we have to start. That conversation might look different, but the ultimate goal will still be the same. Right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I want to actually just sharpen the point a little bit, right? So you alluded to what Indian policy has claimed to be or has wanted to be, vice what it has been. Arguably, the current government has even dispensed with much of that, right? The current government has very unabashedly pursued Indian national interests quite openly, and not to make any sort of normative judgment on that. I think that's a quite a defensible observation of what the current government is doing. But the question is, does feminism in foreign policy or a more inclusive foreign policy or consideration of broadening the lens of policy considerations and broadening the conversation to make it more democratic and inclusive, does that necessarily require any trade-offs, any difficult decisions to be made where a more traditionalist, elite-driven, securitized foreign policy must necessarily make some trade-offs? Or could you make the case that, in fact, a more inclusive policy and a more democratically derived policy is actually overlaps greatly with Indian national interests? How do you see that? Is there necessarily a trade-off there?
In an ideal situation, no. In reality, yes. And these trade-offs are not so obvious when it comes to how you make policy. I would say India in that sense is in a very good position because we are still learning how to make good foreign policy. I don't think we're there yet. Not to say that any country is perfect at it, but we're still learning. And in that sense, then we have the potential to learn in a direction that is better, where we are not playing catch up, 5 years down the line, which has been the case in some areas of our foreign policy. But when it comes to, very specifically trade-offs, so there are two again parallel tracks over here, right? Now, the some parts of creating a feminist foreign policy is also to break open your system, which means you need to change your structures, you need to change mindsets, you need to bring more women into your foreign policy making system, whether it is your ministry or whether it's that larger ecosystem that you engage with. Then it's not only about women. In the case of India, for example, and I think some other countries as well, it's about bringing people from other parts of this country. You know, foreign policy, as you know, has rested very much with a certain elite group in India now, elite men and women, right? So how do you ensure that other voices from other parts of the country come in? So that's system change in a very basic fashion. So that's one angle. Now, what we have understood from many countries is that when you create either a quota or you create a system where you have to have X number of women or X number of different communities. I know the conversation in Australia, for example, is about bringing more indigenous voices into that whole system. There will be backlash. You cannot expect there not to be any backlash. And we've seen the backlash, we've heard about it, we've studied it, we've analyzed it from other countries, where a man has worked, you know, for 30 years in his career and then has lost out on a position because that position had to be filled by a woman or somebody else. You're going to face backlash. Now, how do you deal with that? That I think is very country dependent as to how you put, but that is one side of it. So there are, in that sense, trade-offs, but not in a very traditional sense of trade-offs. You're going to have to figure out how to create that systems change that doesn't sort of upset the entire apple cart, doesn't create a backlash that you're unable to deal with, and doesn't create a movement that is then more detrimental than what you had to begin with. So that you have to figure out. Now, in India, if we have seen which we have been tracking the numbers within the system, there are more women now than there ever have been in the ministry. There are also more people coming from different parts of this country, outside of, you know, your elite sort of cities. So that change is already happening. It's very slow. Would I like it to be faster? Yes. But to say that it's not happening is not true. It's happening in a fashion that's, I think, working for the system in India, because we don't like very sudden change. I think this gradual change works for us. And the more different voices you see coming into the ministry means very soon that rolling effect will happen, and that change will then be as fast as, you know, maybe 10 years down the line, it will be at a point where I would like it to be now. The other side of it then is trade-offs in your policy making. And there is where I would say that I don't think you need to actually have trade-offs. This is not about this a policy versus another policy. It's about just opening up how you think about a certain kind of policy making decision and then implementation. So does this mean that we don't have a certain kind of policy when it comes to our difficult neighbors? No, but how do we break open that policy that has been very focused only on hard security, military, and a very hardline angle of where we look at our borders, where we look at our relationships, where we look at then various other aspects of that policy making. So how can we break open that whole area when we think about it, right? So it's not a question of then trade-offs. It's a question of just increasing your perspectives so that your next policy that you bring out will hopefully be better. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. But let me press you on this issue, right? Because I don't know if this has happened, but I can imagine, at least hypothetically, that the answer to, or the response from some of those vested interests, some of those elite vested interests would be, yeah, listen, that's all very well and good. And it's all very well and good for comfortable Sweden and comfortable Canada to talk about a feminist foreign policy. But we've got to feed 1 billion mouths, and we've got 2 nuclear armed neighbors on our borders. We can't afford to indulge in these sorts of considerations. We've got to be very hard-nosed about how we do it and what we do. How would you respond to that sort of critique?
One, I don't think today Sweden thinks it's very comfortable given the current situation. Maybe Canada a little bit, but then I mean, yes, we get this all the time, right? We cannot be Sweden. Yes, we cannot be Sweden. I don't think we should even try to be Sweden. But then you look at what Mexico has done. Mexico is in a very similar position to India in many ways. Yeah, not with a difficult neighborhood perhaps, but in many other ways, right? So look at Mexico to an example. Look at Spain. Spain is is very different in that sense. If you look at all the other European countries that have embarked on this path, France or Germany or Sweden, Luxembourg, Spain is very different in both their internal domestic issues that they have, and when it comes to their economic development, when it comes to their foreign policy and security policy. So we look at Spain then as a potential example. I mean, in India are all hoping that Australia, once this election is done, will embark on this path, right? So then we look at Australia as an example. On that one hand, this is a criticism we counter pretty easily. And I know a lot of our partners in Australia are doing it as well, right? Because Sweden is a different ball game altogether. However, on the other side of we don't have the luxury to indulge is a very entrenched way of thinking that adding more voices to a difficult situation to get different perspectives is a luxury. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity, right? And that is a very entrenched. And I was thinking that, if I can get through this 1 hour without using the word patriarchy, I think that would have been great, but it's not possible, right? In this kind of a conversation, it's a very patriarchal way of thinking that women cannot handle hard decisions, that women cannot sit at the table and think about, okay, what do we need to do with a very difficult neighborhood? And that women don't have the ability to make these kind of decisions. This is absolutely untrue. So in that sense, it's not a luxury, but a necessity, because clearly we haven't reached the desired goals that we've wanted to reach. So why not open up that discussion? Maybe you will get a whole bunch of new ideas. I know I'm simplifying this, but sometimes these things need to be simplified a little bit, right? That you'll get a whole bunch of new ideas that could work. In that sense, I would say we have to open up that discussion. Now, whether we are talking about our difficult neighbors and the fact that this is a highly militarized, nuclearized, sorry, I don't know if that's a word, but nuclearized region, or the fact that we are feeding 1 billion, we need to feed 1+ billion people in this country, and clearly many other parts of the world as well. I mean, we know already what is going to be the cascading effects of the fact that India has slowing down its wheat export, right? I know it's the conversation happening right now is about us banning, but we're not actually completely banning the wheat export. We're just reserving it for countries that we feel are most in need. And if you look at those countries that we have defined as possibly most in need, it actually does speak to some of this core concept of what a feminist foreign policy means, is that we are looking at the ones that need it more than the ones that, I mean, not to say that somebody needs food more than the other, but maybe others can have the ability to figure it out, whereas certain countries will not have that ability, right? So when we talk about what's going to happen internally in India, you need to have voices from all the different kinds of people within India to say, yes, your policy in West Bengal, when it comes to West Bengal, because of the Bangladesh being a neighbor, needs to ensure that different kinds of people are part of that conversation. When you look at Gujarat or Rajasthan with our western neighbor, or when you look at our southern states, so in that sense, I mean, it's not and this or that, right? It's opening it up.
Absolutely. And indeed, I think it was, I might be getting the person wrong, but I think it was Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense here, who at one time at Congress very bluntly said that if Congress, you do not finance adequately US overseas development assistance, then I, in the Defense Department, have to buy more bullets. It's not actually a trade-off. That actually, just as diversity, increasing diversity improves decision-making and the efficiency of policy-making, in the same way, considering many of these policy options that for too long have been neglected can actually not only not detract from security concerns, but can actually alleviate, can actually be a better policy response rather than detracting from them. So let's move now to that second issue of intersectionality. You've already brought up several times the fact that this is not just about gender issues, right? These are a much broader suite of issues, especially revolving around inequality, economic inequality, ethnic inequality, environmental inequality. Can you just sort of provide a bit of a capstone on that discussion that you've alluded to a couple of times? When we discuss all of these heretofore excluded voices and considerations in foreign policy, what is it about a feminist foreign policy that helps us, to bring a prism that not only addresses gender issues, but also addresses this whole range of other unheard voices and unconsidered policy imperatives?
I mean, you've a little bit answered the question already, in that it's not one or the other, right? It's about broadening the scope of what is possible, both from a right from the start. When you do research for a potential foreign policy decision or a security policy decision, where is that research coming from? Who are you considering in that research? Maybe even who's doing that research for you? To analysis, to then discussion, to then implementation. How have we seen, how do we then look at all of these stages for a country? And then we're speaking more specifically about India. Who are the different voices, lenses, perspectives in all of these stages? If you do not have all of these lenses that are required at every stage, and then of course implementation, your policy is going to be lacking. And I think that's the very basic basis of how a feminist foreign policy then changes very fundamentally how countries make foreign policy. And I'll give you a very small, what is a very small example, but the potential effects of that are much bigger. Is that when let's say X country wants to give money to build a school, and for those who already heard some of what I've said before, this is the same example I give every time, but I think it's really effective. When X country wants to build a school in Y country, there are many different considerations that come into that, right? But let's assume they have picked in consultation with with Y country where the school is going to be built, some village, right? Now, at the research stage, have you ensured that that school has all the different kinds of access it needs? Have you ensured that the school that you're saying is for boys and girls has bathrooms for girls? And this might seem really small, but I've studied many such policies. We build schools. The global community has built schools in many parts of the world, and bathrooms have been built. There are no bathrooms for girls, right? How did you miss that out? Now, I don't need a woman in that discussion. I just need a more aware person to say that yes, bathrooms need to be built in that school for boys and for girls. And given the way the world is changing now, maybe you need to have non-binary bathrooms as well, whatever that means. Now, that might not be possible in every single country. So we need to also understand then what is the reality of that country, what is the need of that country, what is their goals and visions, right? And then come to an understanding that works for everyone. So from your research stage to your analysis to your consultation with your government to then them creating a policy internally to then them implementing it. After that, then when you do budgeting, when you do you come back and see what is your policy working or not, ensure that your different perspectives are part of that. And there is where it's completely missing. Whether you talk about Sweden, Canada, or India, it's missing across the board, right? Is there? So that again, it becomes really important, is to ensure that the policy that you made might have been amazing. And to be sure, India has had created some really fantastic policies. But did we ever go back to ensure that they were implemented in the way that they were originally intended? Not so much. And very few countries now have started to do this, right? So it's about just breaking open that way in which we think about it. And yes, it's about women at the very start of it, but it's also about the different kinds of communities, and I will say this 100 times if I need to, that might be affected by the policy that you are creating and then implementing. Have you brought them into the decision making process from the get-go? If not, your policy is going to fail, and we are already seeing the effects of that.
Yep, no, absolutely. And that actually is a very neat segue into the next topic that I want to discuss, which is the domestic foundations of policy, right? Because a key element of what you're talking about in a more inclusive foreign policy and in a feminist foreign policy is democratizing the process of policymaking, to bring in more voices, to have more people at the table. So I want to discuss that issue now in the remainder of the time that we have. And in fact, let me begin. Let me begin with a broader question. As far as you know, having been working on this for some time now, in the Indian context specifically, do you see support for these principles of a more inclusive policy, a more feminist foreign policy, in the Indian foreign policy elite? Right, elite, by which I mean not just MEA, but the Delhi elite more generally. Is there a groundswell of support for this? And I might ask sort of a meta question: how do you know how much support there is, or how much resistance there is to this sort of innovation?
Support, yes. I wouldn't call it yet a groundswell as much as I would like it to be, but yes, there is support both within the ministry and the larger ecosystem. So people who work directly with the ministry, people who work in that entire larger circle that creates this policy. Now the support is varying. Some of it's very strong. Some of it is still, I call it support, even though they are on the fence, because there is the whole group of people that are incredibly critical and not constructively. So we leave them aside for the moment. How do I know this? Is because through our process for the last couple of years that we've been doing this in India right now. And we are, I wouldn't say, in the beginning you said I was the person. I wouldn't say that. And I'm not like falsely humble or anything, but we are definitely one of the leading organizations that's working on this subject right now. And I think given how long we've been doing this, we are probably the only organization that knows what this means from an Indian context better than most others at this stage, at least. And how do we know this? Is because we've spoken to a lot of people, either directly through interviews, and a lot of them have been closed door interviews, so people have been very candid. We've had discussions, we've had events, roundtables. I mean, whatever a think tank does, we've done all of it, and we've done it in a way that helps us to understand not what we think India should do, but what the collective thinks India should do. And so everything that's in our new report right now is coming from those conversations. I'm happy to say that many people think that India is in a very good position already, in that sense, and I do also feel like India is in a good position, not only for a domestic audience, but for a global audience, in that. And going back to what I said right in the beginning, this conversation that is still happening in a very small group of countries, it needs to break open. It needs to break open from a understanding, from what this actually means, and how countries are then going to change that concept of global governance going forward. And you cannot do this without a country like India or a country like Australia or several others around the world. So in that sense, we are at a very good position. I can also say that there have been statements from the ministry as well, public statements. The foreign minister himself, in an article that where he was interviewed last year, used the word feminist foreign policy, and many serving officers that we have spoken to, both men and women. I always want to make that clear. Are very interested on how this can actually work, and I take that as a positive.
So that's great news, and I think that's extremely encouraging, because making that sort of declaratory beginning is a very important first step. But let me again press you on this and ask you a slightly harder question. Have you had any examples thus far, and maybe there haven't, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, but have there been examples of where people have gone beyond talk to actually absorb a personal or institutional cost to themselves to advance this agenda of a feminist foreign policy? You know, so the sort of the most most sort of boiled down example would be, has anyone given up their seat in order to let someone else have a seat at the table? I mean, obviously that's not necessary. You don't need to lose voices to expand the conversation. But what I'm getting at is, have people put their money where their mouths are to sort of say, look, yes, we are committed to this. We are restructuring something, part of the ministry, in order to do this. Is there any sort of more tangible evidence of a commitment to this?
Yes. I mean, has anyone given up a seat voluntarily? I'm not sure. There have been system changes in countries where there is a certain requirement now. So in Spain, for example, they did have some changes within the ministry, as in many other countries as well. I'm fairly certain there was a involuntary giving up of seats in that sense, but in a more policy perspective, not a numbers perspective, definitely yes. Mexico has now, so Mexico is an interesting example, and this is a question that comes up, is that India doesn't have a national action plan for the women, peace and security agenda. I mean, would it have been good to have one? Yes. Does it stop us from going on this path if we don't have one? No. And Mexico then is a good example over there. So what they are trying to do is change the nature of how the ministry is, both internally in terms of makeup, and also then how their entire foreign policy ecosystem globally, so with their embassies, how they think about policy change, right? So they started with very small steps, but these are very important steps. Training, increasing the number of women in their embassies across the world. Not to say that, they've replaced a man with a woman, but they've just increased the numbers in some ways. Are all the people being in those embassies being trained to use this lens? What does this lens mean for Mexico? So all of these things are happening, or are in the process of happening from Mexico's perspective.
What about in India? In India?
India. So if we I would say no, not really, not from a feminist foreign policy perspective. But when you consider some of the decisions that we have made, they already speak to a feminist foreign policy. There is very good gender consideration, for example, in our policies when it comes to development assistance, when it comes to climate, when it comes to little bit health, and then little bit trade, little bit multilateral institutions. The former foreign secretary Harsh Shringla, who was he's now as of May 1st, the G20 coordinator for India. And in an article on Sunday, he said that in the Hindustan Times, he said very clearly that the gender considerations are going to be an important part of India's G20 presidency next year. And I have no doubt that he will put that into motion. For anyone who knows how he has worked, he's not only going to say this and then not do anything about it, because he's the kind of person, and I think the ministry right now realizes that if you make such a statement in a very leading Indian daily, people are going to notice, and which means you can't just say things for saying them sake, right? And so there are these bits and pieces. They're just a little bit all over the place in India. And so what we are also trying to do is collect all of that and to say that, we are already on this path. Just can we structure it? Can we framework it a little bit better? And then make it more streamlined going forward.
And that's fair enough. It is still early days. And as you say, I think that sort of, tying one's hands by making sort of open public commitments to pursue certain policies is not insignificant. So I think it's a good bit of evidence at this early stage, certainly. We've had one related question in the Q&A that's a really interesting question that echoes a lot of debates that we see throughout the world when we're talking about progressive politics, right? There's always a tension between incrementalism and transformative policies, right? And so the question we've gotten in the Q&A is, to what extent, or in order to be effective, would a feminist foreign policy have to work within existing structures and institutions, or to what extent does it have to be truly transformational in order to, structurally transformational in order to achieve its intended effects?
So this is a difficult question, and I will say right off, I don't know the answer to this yet from an Indian perspective yet. Maybe ask me this again in a few months. But a certain amount of transformation is 100% required, whether you talk about it from a rights representation perspective in terms of just numbers, or you talk about it from a policy concept implementation perspective. If you look at what Germany is doing right now, the Federal Foreign Office had a feminist foreign policy, which then changed when the government changed earlier this year, when the new government came into power, and their entire government now has a feminist foreign policy. Do they know what this means? Do they know how they're going to do this? No. Are they trying to figure it out? Yes. But they have made some very drastic changes already within the system. Are these changes going to work? We don't know yet. But I think that's okay that we don't know this already. But just the fact that there are going to be changes, and that we will see these, what kind of effects these change have, is important, because you have to be open to thinking in a new way. You have to be open to that kind of change. Now, within India's very sort of narrow ways in which we do this, I would say changes, yes, it is possible, and it's also doable in a very basic way, to say that can this work, simply because the way we've been tracking the foreign policy systems for the last many years right now, and we're now going back about 20 years to see how our foreign policy might have changed. The numbers are already better than they have ever been in the last 5 years. They've been increasing steadily. The number of women at higher positions are more. They're still small, but they're more than they have been. The way we think about policy, the way we bring in a different lens into some areas of our policy, that change is already happening. Is it going to tomorrow break open this entire system of how we make policy in India? Absolutely not. And if anyone is thinking that that's what's going to happen, then I mean, yeah, that's not going to happen. But will it happen soon? Some people always ask me, when is India going to make this announcement? Now, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be in a very different position right now. But I would say, given what we have found, and given the kind of statements we have seen coming out of the ministry, realistically, I would say, why not in a couple of years? I think after our G20 presidency in 2024, it's a great time to make this announcement, to say that we have an intention, we already have evidence, we just need to create a structure that works for us, and then begin on this path. So I'm very...
That's excellent, and it's a good segue. We are now out of time, but you have given me a good segue to my last sort of concluding question for you, which is that you and I do not sit in any foreign ministry. We are not the executives to make these decisions, and nor, I suspect, most or all of the people listening to this. So the question for you is, how do people in, say, the world of research, or in the world of advocacy, civil society, activism, what are the things that people outside of government right now can do to advance this agenda, to ensure that either official foreign policy done by the state, or how a country engages with the outside world more generally, embraces the ideals and the considerations of a feminist or a more inclusive foreign policy? What can we do about this going forward?
I mean, in India, I would say, please come on board with what we are doing. We've got a very good system that we are following, which is working, I think, in some ways. Bring in more, from a research, analysis, universities, think tanks, broaden your research already. Like I said, it needs to begin with the research, right? To the development community, especially in a country like India, and many others also, broaden that concept of what you think gender and development needs to be. The one thing that we have been trying to do in India is to bring the idea of gender mainstreaming out of the development sector into that foreign policy and security space, which it's not really been a part of, if you think about it, as in a very systematic format, right? So let's broaden that lens. And then for anybody else that wants to be part of this conversation, learn and understand what this means. And then, wherever you are, whichever country you are, find an organization that's doing this and work with them. These are the very easy things that can already can already happen. And if you have a voice with your government, I would say use that voice. However, please learn and understand what this means before you use your voice, because in some cases you might have only one opportunity, right? And this is, I mean, this is not men versus women or men versus the world, or women versus the world kind of situation. So in that sense, I say, please understand what this actually means from a global perspective, understand what it could mean from your country's perspective, and then sort of join in. Yeah. All very idealized, but it's important, little bit important.
No, I think it's absolutely. And I think in your final answer, you struck upon two things that are critical to this conversation, to this understanding. And I think they're excellent takeaways to conclude with. One is, as we said at the beginning, at the outset, that everything is highly contextual. It's highly situational, depending on what country you are sitting in and what issues you are facing. And the second is almost the obverse of that. It's not just contextual, but it touches everything. These ideas touch everything from high politics and security down to things that are traditionally left out of foreign policy making. Certainly big issues like development assistance, trade, climate policy. This is not just about women's bathrooms. This touches everything. And these are big issues that touch every human on this planet. So thank you very much. Ambika Vishwanath is the co-founder and co-director of the Kubernein Initiative. Their recent report from a couple of weeks ago is Opportunities for a More Inclusive Indian Foreign Policy, which has been a really useful way to start and frame this discussion of what it means to have a more inclusive and a feminist foreign policy for India. Ambika, thank you very much.
Thank you, Arzan. Thank you very much, everyone.